Welcome to today's session, which is on the impact of World War I on America. And our overarching question for today's session is, how did the USA emerge from the war? So, why did America get involved in the war in the first place? Well, the USA had been reluctant to get involved because throughout the 19th century, their official policy was to isolate themselves from European politics, and this was called the isolationist policy. But a series of events throughout 1915 to 1917, starting with the sinking of the Lusitania, which had a high proportion of American citizens on board, meant that America did officially declare war in 1917 on Germany. And this obviously led to a huge propaganda campaign and the recruitment of millions of their citizens into active service. Now, the war ended in 1918, and America, like other countries, had suffered, but they were part of then that success and determining next steps after the war. One of the major benefits for America was an increase in their economic strength. They had come out of the war as the world's leading economy. So how would the war help that? Well, firstly, a one-way trading system had developed with Europe. Money had poured into the USA for food, raw materials, ammunition, and as a result of that, American industry and agriculture had prospered. The second benefit was that during the war, the USA had taken over European overseas markets, and many American industries had become more successful than their European competitors. For example, the USA had replaced Germany as the world's leading producer of fertilizers, dyes, and other chemical products. And finally, the war had led to advances in technology. For example, mechanization and new materials like plastics. The USA was the world leader in developing these technologies and applying them to industry. So here's some evidence to show you of those huge economic benefits. Just take a look at chemicals, chemical exports, and the millions of dollars. It's gone up from 21.9 million in 1914, and in 3 years' time, it's up to $281 million that are being sold in exports. So just give you a moment to have a look at some of those figures. And of course, it's always good to be able to quote evidence, specific evidence like this, to show the huge economic benefits of this period. So with economic success, sometimes comes problems for certain social groups and certain economic problems as a result. So the first thing to talk about here is on the right hand side, you've got a series of evidence that I'll be referring to, and I would like you to include that in your notes as we discuss the key points. So number one is unemployment. Well, firstly, you had 4 million people recruited for the war who returned in 1919 and obviously were looking for work. On top of that, there was obviously less demand for goods in Europe after the war, and what that meant was lots of workers had been laid off and they were looking for work at the same time. On top of that, prices had doubled between 1914 and 1919, but wages didn't fall in line with that. They had hardly risen at all. So workers were demanding higher wages, but because of the high levels of unemployment, the businesses and the boss owners knew that they didn't have to compromise. So what you had throughout 1919 was a wave of violent strikes, which were not uncommon in this period. The second sort of big outcome was a fear of radicalism. In 1917, there had been a communist revolution in Russia, and America, as the home of capitalism, really feared the potential of communism starting to find its way into American society. And communist parties were established in 1919, And there was a series of bomb attacks by anarchists during this period as well. Now finally, in 23 cities across the US, there were race riots in 1919. So many black people who had moved to the northern cities from the south after 1910 because there were more opportunities for work found themselves under attack from white communities. And so what this led to was discrimination and poor economic circumstances for black people. So that was what was going on the home front, but what about America in the wider world? Well, as you know, prior to World War I, America had pursued a policy of isolationism, and as a result of being more actively involved in World War I by the end, the Democratic president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, proposed something known as the League of Nations. Now, the principle behind it was one of collective security, the idea that all states work together to protect any one of the others from being attacked by an aggressor. And he created a 14-point plan to sort of be the basis of the League of Nations and what it should do. Now, America never actually joined. The League was created in early 1920, but unfortunately, Wilson faced a backlash from Congress, who very much objected to America's role and felt like they needed to go back to the isolationist policy that they had before World War I. And what that led to in the 1921 election was Wilson being removed from power and the Democrats and being replaced by the Republican President Harding. And what Harding called for was a term called normalcy. So first coined by the Republicans at this time, they wanted to go back to some form of normalcy, as they called it. And as you can see, lots of images emerged at the time as to why maybe they wanted to avoid being drawn into world affairs, because you can see from the cartoon on the right-hand side, America being pulled in different directions and pretty much at the mercy of other countries. And then there were other images such as this one, the Uncle Sam sitting reading about it, but obviously not having joined it and being isolated with some of those other countries. And again, like all aspects of this course, I really want to think 100 years or so on, what are the connotations with today? Well, let's just take a look at some recent headlines and, Trump trying to remove America from the World Health Organization, a sort of worldwide body that looks out for human health, and also looking to pull out of things like the World Trade Organization. That's on top of him threatening to withdraw funding from the likes of NATO and so on. So again, what we're seeing 100 years on really is a Republican president and Republican Party that are very much following similar principles that were promoted 100 years ago. So for some Americans, these feelings of isolationism went even further. And they wanted to end the open door policy that had brought millions of people to the USA in the 19th century. Attitudes had been shifting for some time with regards to immigrants, but by 1900 there was not as much land available, and as industry became more mechanized, there was obviously less need for workers. And so some Americans felt that the quality of immigrants was declining, and many of the newer immigrants were poor labourers with little formal education. So what you had was, in 1917, a literacy test that meant immigrants had to prove they could read a 40-word passage before they could be allowed into America. And what that did was disadvantage people from Eastern Europe, Italy and Russia, those sort of more recent migrants that were making their way to America. After the war, problems for new immigrants that did manage to get in got worse, and immigrant ghettos were starting to appear in some of those big northern cities in America. And they were often really dangerous places with lots of crime, drunkenness and prostitution. And ultimately, even though it was sort of American policy to push them into ghettos, they blamed these immigrants for urban problems. And so what you had at the time our course is starting is this real xenophobia, this intolerance of foreigners, which continued right into the sort of 1920s. And just to put things in perspective for you, on the next slide here, it just shows you in 1920 the makeup of the foreign population of America and how widespread it was and how big those groups already were. So as always, I want to try and bring it back a little bit to what's going on in the 21st century and current American policy towards immigrants. There's now a wealth test that immigrants need to go through, and if they don't have a certain amount of money, they're not allowed into the country. So very much deterring people from entering. There's still an ongoing issue with the US-Mexico border and migrants coming from South and Central America across that border. And as you hopefully know, one of Trump's main campaign promises was to build a wall. And finally, you hopefully get a real sense of really sort of that worry that some Americans might have here, looking at the graph below and looking at the increase in the migrant population, and then as a proportion of the population as well. So if you take a look at 2020, there's approximately 50 million immigrants in America at the moment, and they make up 14.3% of the nation as a whole, the proportion of the population. And if you look back, actually, it's around World War I, 1910, 1920, when it was last at that high level that it is now. And what you're obviously seeing again is xenophobia starting to emerge. And I'll just take you back to the late 19th century, and I think this is a fantastic image, which I'd like you to interpret really as part of your sort of final task, and to think about what is going on here. What do you think the caption might be beneath this? And it's something we'll pick up on in class. But this is from 1891. And again, I think lots of it resonates with what's going on today. So finally, just to sum up the main consequences of the First World War in America, it brought them huge economic strength, but with that came lots of social and economic problems. The immigration problems really came to the fore after World War I. Prior to that, there had been a degree of acceptance as America was expanding. And then you see America go back into that isolationist approach in the way it deals with the rest of the world.